All right, and a little bit of a technical difficulty there, and I believe we're about to get started. All right, so I ran through some slides about what Trimarc does, from our Active Directory security assessment to our Microsoft Cloud security assessment to our Visa, our VMware security assessment. And now we're going to talk about the top 10 ways to improve Active Directory security quickly. This webcast is scheduled for 75 minutes and the presentation will run about an hour. There will be Q&A after the presentation, so please submit your questions and the moderators will review and publish questions. Thumbs or like the questions you want to hear answered, with the most popular ones being answered first. We will share links to the slides and the recording through email to you if you've registered for this webcast, and we will also publish that at trimarc.co/security-webcast in the next few days. Thank you for joining our webcast today. I'm really excited to share with you the Trimarc Top 10 list of things to do to improve Active Directory security quickly. Trimarc performs security assessments for customers, so we have a solid understanding of the current challenges with AD environments. We start this presentation by covering modern Active Directory attacks and then move into several sections that cover the most important actions to improve Active Directory security. Then we'll wrap up the session with our top 10 list. This presentation is packed with technical content, so let's get started. I'm Sean Metcalf, the founder and CTO of Trimarc. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master in Active Directory, a Microsoft MVP, and have spoken at some of the largest security conferences around the world on Active Directory and Azure AD attack and defense. Joining me are Tyler Robinson and Daryl Baker, also at Trimarc. So I'll pass it over to Tyler to introduce himself. Tyler.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate that. And thank you, everybody, for showing up today. It's great to have you here, and hopefully you get some great value out of the time we get to spend together. My name is Tyler Robinson. I'm an offensive security researcher here at Trimarc. I've spent the last several decades working in the offensive space, hacking just about everything I can get my hands on. I've been a speaker at B-Sides to multiple military branches. I've done some black hat training. I'm also a podcast personality on Security Weekly, and I've tested many of the largest organizations in the world from an offensive standpoint. So I'll pass it off to Daryl now to introduce himself.
My name is Daryl Baker. I'm a security consultant here at Trimarc. I am a purple teamer and threat emulator. I'm also the creator of Active Directory Hacking Village. This year you can catch me speaking at the Experts Conference, and I am also an advocate for all things radio and wireless.
Excellent, thank you. Today's agenda starts with information about modern attacks, including NTLM and Kerberos relay attacks, as well as KrbRelayUp, one of the latest and probably most published attack over the past several months. Then we delve into examples of issues in Active Directory and recommendations on how to fix them. Each of these items are broken out and categorized by section. We start with password attacks, discuss issues with AD admin accounts, overprivileged service accounts, Active Directory certificate services, Kerberos delegation, auditing NTLM and SMB, what we call dangerous defaults, which we'll explain more later, controlling local admin accounts, domain controller security, and close out with discussing what is Tier 0 and how you can start down that path. Oops. After covering quite a bit of technical material, we wrap up with the Trimarc Top 10 list of how to improve AD security quickly, things you can do this week, next week, and in the coming weeks. At that point, we'll switch over to Q&A, so please, again, submit your questions and vote on the questions you want answered. So let's get started. Tyler, why don't you tell us about AD attacks?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, today's modern AD attacks, we would think that with today's security controls, all the improvements we have for Active Directory, for Windows, all the blinky light boxes that we purchase, EDR, you think there'd be a lot less attack surface for attackers today. But as we've seen in the news through the multiple breaches, the different ransomware gangs and extortion happening, this is definitely not the case. So today's attacks are not always based on exploits or not always based on things that are getting thrown by attackers that rely on those exploits. Often these are just misconfigurations or abuses of their intended use. Attackers and ransomware are leveraging these lax configurations and complexities within inside of Active Directory for things like initial access, persistence, to get access to the information for things like ransomware or extortion, or to further their attacks through supply chains. All of these things are part of the attacks that are happening today, and Active Directory is at the center and the core of that, whether that's through Active Directory or Azure Online or single sign-on providing identities through those things. All of these complexities and connections are lending themselves to very difficult defense measures that attackers are abusing consistently, which is why there are so many modern Active Directory attacks today. We're going to walk through a couple of those attacks and kind of talk through some of the attacks that are happening in Active Directory today, but we obviously can't cover all of those with inside of this limited time on a webinar. So as we go through some of the attacks, and Sean covers a lot of the mitigations and things within inside of Active Directory that can really lead to a much better defense in depth posture and maturity improvements that adequately protect your environments today, continue to think about the ones that are going to apply and be easier to put into place very quickly. Those are our ultimate goals today, is to really show the attacks and then show not just the IOCs and TTPs that can be combated, but look at the behavior and the settings within inside of Active Directory that are there and available in order to configure to block a lot of these attacks. Things like the printer bug, relaying, password spraying, all of these attacks, the new ADCS attacks and KrbRelayUp. All these attacks have mitigating and compensating controls within inside of Active Directory if you're leveraging and doing a lot of the basics right. And we're going to cover a lot of those and how you can actually do those. So as we walk through this, we're going to pass this over to Daryl so he can actually walk through a little bit of the relay attacks, which is one of the mechanisms in which many of the attackers are leveraging in today's modern AD attacks for that initial access or credentials.
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, so we're going to start off talking about authentication protocol relay attacks. And like Tyler said, these are oldies but goodies. We're seeing these as part of chained attacks, but this is still a very relevant attack. It's very easy to pull off, and we see them over and over and over again in the wild. So an authentication protocol relay attack is when the credentials, the authentication credentials, are captured from a victim resource, and then they're relayed to another target resource, impersonating the identity of a victim. So here we're looking at NTLM relay. In NTLM relay, the victim goes out to try to access some arbitrary resource. The attacker is in the middle of this here. It intercepts that session and then relays it on to an attack target. The NTLM authentication process continues on, and now the attacker has access to the attack target, impersonating that victim. KrbRelayUp relay is a bit different, and so we're going to take a look at that here on this next slide. KrbRelayUp depends on a ticket paradigm. So when we're talking about KrbRelayUp relay, typically we're talking about either relaying ticket granting tickets or relaying service tickets. If you relay a ticket granting ticket, you're able to request an infinite amount of service tickets within a certain time frame as an impersonated user. If you relay a service ticket, you're able to then use that service ticket to access a specific resource as a specific user. Now, there are some cases with delegation where that's not always the case, but that is a general idea of how that works. So here in this diagram of KrbRelayUp relay, this is just one way that this can happen. A victim goes ahead and tries to access a resource again. It kicks off that KrbRelayUp process. So he goes to the domain controller, gets a ticket granting ticket, uses that ticket granting ticket to get a service ticket, and then that victim presents the service ticket to whatever resource that it's trying to get to. Well, if an attacker controls a computer object, for instance, that attacker can use a resource-based constrained delegation and then go back to the domain controller requesting an S4U to proxy ticket, which then actually gets a service ticket on behalf of that victim that the attacker can use to access the target service. So I'm not going to get too much into different delegation types and these tickets. Tyler's going to touch on that a little bit more in the next section, but we did want to show you the differences between the NTLM relay versus the KrbRelayUp relay. But the idea is the same. A user has a session, those credentials are somewhere. We're in the middle, we're able to intercept those credentials and then relay them onto a target resource impersonating that victim. So that leaves us with a question of how does one become this person in the middle? Usually that's done through some form of spoofing or poisoning of a service. Commonly used protocols are LLMNR, SMB, HTTP, ADCS. We're seeing left and right. Every few months, there's a new attack vector leveraging ADCS in some form or fashion. So I don't see that going away anytime soon. But these are just a few of the protocols. A lot of them can be used, and they can also be used in conjunction with one another to move laterally. Another way to attain that person in the middle status is through credential dumping. Normally in an Active Directory environment, when we're looking at credential dumping, we really see it in three different forms. We see it in dumping of the LSAS process. So it's just directly dumping those credentials out of memory. We see it with DC sync-like attacks, which is when you can coerce a domain controller to send you information out of Active Directory, or actually dumping via Active Directory database itself. So dumping that ntds.dit file and then extracting out the information if you can. When it comes to Kerberos relays, we see a lot more of combinations with these protocols. So SMB is used a lot of time leveraging delegations towards attacks like the printer bug, but protocols such as HTTP can then be moved laterally to LDAP for the priv exchange exploit, and the same with SMB moving laterally towards LDAPs for the drop the mic. ADCS, again, there are so many different attacks. Petit Patam is just one of many that we see surfacing every few months these days. So in the next slide, we're actually going to look at a video of an NTLM relay happening in real time, and you'll see how quickly this happens. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and I'm going to run an nmap script against my domain controllers in the environment so I can see if we have protocol signing in place. If SMB signing is in place, this will not work. So here we do have SMB signing in place, but it is not required, and that is very important. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and spin up an in-packet script that is going to do the relaying for us, and we're going to spin up Responder, which is an open source application which will broadcast out an SMB server and wait for a client to connect. So here, Windows client is connected to some arbitrary share. In our in-packet script has then relayed it on, and it has created a nice little interactive shell for us here that we can connect to right back on our loopback on our local machine. So here we'll spin up ncat. We'll connect to that session. And I'm able to list out the shares and all the files that are on that domain controller. And as you can see, we're logged in as Bruce Wayne on that domain controller very quickly. That took a whole, I think, a minute and a few extra seconds. So these types of attacks can happen very, very quickly, and we see them all the time. So again, that brings us to another question. How do we detect these things, and what can we do to mitigate that? We've kind of broken this up into a grid of easy, medium, and hard, just based on what we've seen in our experience with the reports that we do on a regular basis. So when it comes to mitigation and really protecting yourself against these types of attacks, from the easy standpoint, enabling extended protection for authentication, as well as disabling some of the older broadcast protocols, such as MDNS and LLMNR, are easy wins. You also want to limit the machine account quota attribute. Some of the more medium things are more hands-on, so it does require you as the administrator to do a little bit more work, right? So this involves doing some LDAP queries to identify some potential spins that are available in your environment. And by spins, I mean service principal names that are in your environment. We also want to ensure that protocol signing is in place. Remember, this attack would not have worked at all simply if SMB signing was enabled and enforced. But it was not required, and so we were able to easily grab that session and relay it on. Also, you want to pay attention to security event IDs. So you want to look at event IDs that have to do with TCP connections, looping back to your local host, as well as events that have to do with changes to directory objects, ticket granting ticket requests, and service ticket requests. So now on to the hard stuff. The hard stuff is disabling NTLM completely. The issue with that is that there are a lot of services and applications that still rely on NTLM authentication. And so it's very hard for a lot of environments to get rid of it. Channel binding. Channel binding is very hard to implement enterprise-wide. In theory, it's a very simple thing to do. It's one of those things that operationally can be more complex than it seems on paper. And of course, lastly, I want to mention that if we could have everything in an encrypted tunnel, everything was under IPsec, we're using IKE v2, you know, that's a perfect world. But again, that's something that we always strive towards, and that's a very, very hard thing for most environments to achieve. But, you know, looking at this matrix, these are some of the things that would easily stop this type of an attack. So now I will hand it back over to Tyler, and Tyler will show you how this attack, used in conjunction with some other things, can be used to really do some damage in an environment.
Thanks, Daryl. Yeah, we're going to cover KrbRelayUp now. And before everybody kind of blanks out, like, there is a lot to this particular attack. There's a lot to Kerberos if you've ever had a chance to look at it. So we're going to try and keep it as high level as possible so everyone can digest it and get as much value out of this as possible. And KrbRelayUp is a no-fix local privilege escalation path for attackers. Simplified, it's basically taking the tooling and processes we've had for a little while and some techniques that have been out that leverage KrbRelay, PowerMade, Rubius, SCM, UAC bypass, and follows the work of people like Elad, Lee Christensen, Will Schrodinger, Ahmed Sultan. These people have really taken a lot of these attacks and built these tools. Well, what KrbRelayUp has done is made this a one-click easy script that allows an attacker to get this local privilege escalation on any system within inside the environment. So just to give you kind of a quick rundown so you can understand what we're trying to explain, we'll dive into the details and try and simplify this as much as possible in the next slides. But KrbRelayUp uses a computer object that an attacker creates in order to relay some Kerberos authentication tickets to LDAP and then impersonate any user in order to obtain system on the target host. And we'll get into some of the details on how this actually works, but it is abusing the resource-based constrained delegation setting, and again, covering that later. The one technique we're using here for KrbRelayUp should be noted that many of the mitigations and ways you can do this, there's been improvements and variations on this, things like ADCS, web enrollment, or shadow credentials. Each of those have different aspects to this. So we're going to cover the one very specifically, but just know that there are different ways to achieve the same thing and abuse the same type of Kerberos relay attacks. And to be clear, this is by default works in most Active Directory environments if there's not LDAP signing and or channel binding enforced, which is not the default in most cases. So to kind of put this all together, we're going to break this down into 3 stages. By doing this in 3 stages, it really helps everyone digest what's going on here. So to start, the attacker is going to create a computer object, and he's using this computer object in order to configure resource-based constrained delegation attributes through that computer account, essentially using relaying over to LDAP. In stage 2, the attacker is focusing on leveraging the Kerberos delegation or the ability to impersonate any arbitrary user, hopefully an admin account if that's kind of their goal, and then target the computer account resources on the system that they're on in order to gain that local privilege escalation. And in the 3rd stage, we'll talk through how the attacker is actually creating silver tickets and forged service tickets to authenticate to that target computer as itself, and then gain that local administrator or system level access on that host. So we're going to jump into each of the stages here and kind of dive into the details and try and keep this as high level as possible without losing anybody on the Kerberos nuances. So for stage 1, really the important part here is the attacker is able to get full Active Directory object control. With inside of the attack, the attacker is really looking for the ability to control an attribute on an object in Active Directory. In this case, the easiest way for them to do this, and one of the techniques, is to create a new computer object, because with inside of Active Directory, you have the ability through machine account quota as an authenticated user to create up to 10 computer or Active Directory objects. So once the attacker's created this object, they're able to leverage KrbRelay in order to do a relay attack to LDAP to set this attribute on the target. And the attribute that they set is called allowed to act on behalf of other identity. And don't get too wrapped up around the complexity of what that word is and what that attribute is in Active Directory. Just know it's part of the resource-based constrained delegation, which is in Server 2012, the ability for the resource to actually control who's able to impersonate items to the resource that they control. Prior to that, we had unconstrained delegation, where you can go just about anywhere and impersonate anything. And then you had constrained delegation, where the accounts that were trying to access the resource had the control based on those accounts with inside of a different attribute. So the important thing to know here is we're able to create an object, and we're able to set the allowed to be act on behalf of identity attribute with inside of that. In the next step, we're going to actually step through how this process actually happens. So once we've created this object, we've set the attribute, the attacker is able to do some interesting things with Kerberos and tickets. Now, again, don't get too caught up around some of the nuances of tickets. I'm going to say some things like S4U to self and S4U to proxy, and people that have done Active Directory or Kerberos tend to blank out a little bit on this. But we're trying to make this very simple. The attacker leverages his ability to create a ticket for a couple things. One, for the resource, he creates a ticket granting ticket, a TGT. Next, he creates a TGS, which is a ticket granting service ticket, which allows him to make any arbitrary user with inside that ticket and puts the TGT in there. And then he's able to then get a TGS for a host SPN. Now, all of that's done because of S4U to self, which is essentially the ability to create or generate a ticket for any arbitrary user to a resource. Pretty straightforward. You're able to do that because of the way Active Directory needs to be able to impersonate and delegate access to resources. And then the S4U to proxy is just the ability to request and gain access to a ticket that allows you access to an SPN or a resource via an impersonated resource. So again, a lot of big words there, a lot of things that people don't like to hear for Kerberos, but you're able to request the ticket and get a ticket back as an arbitrary user. In stage 3, we'll show you how that's useful in order to gain access to the device itself. So because we were able to get this ticket for an arbitrary user using S4U to self and proxy, what we've done is now we're able to leverage the resource-based constrained delegation and get a system shell on the device where the resource-based constrained delegation happens. And that's done through the SCM manager. We're able to start a service as the impersonated user. So we've got this ticket and we've got a resource on our computer object. We're able to impersonate that back to our target and thus spawn a system shell via the tickets that we were able to create. Pretty straightforward when you actually break it down at a high level. Again, you can get into some nuances with inside of Active Directory, and some of the resources we include get into the nitty-gritty of how those things happen and what's the encryption and all the nuances of Kerberos. But if you keep it at a high level, there's some areas here that we're going to speak to where Sean actually talks about ways that we can block this, because there are different ways to do this other than creating computer objects. We've got ADCS and the shadow credentials. So at a high level, to summarize, attacker is able to create an object, make a ticket for an arbitrary user, relay that back into the target because of resource-based constrained delegation, and get a system shell, basically getting local administrator on any computer in which they're able to access on the network or through compromise. That's a pretty bad thing. Ransomware today has the ability to deploy persistence, get C2 up on a channel, further their attacks via lateral movement, and all of those are possible because of local administrator. Once local administrator is there, credentials become at risk and those devices are no longer trusted. It becomes very hard to remediate and protect against. But we're going to cover some ways later on how to detect and mitigate many of these attacks and the heuristics around this attack. For KrbRelayUp specifically, though, we have some detections on the left here. You can actually get the slides and kind of follow through ways to detect this. But from a mitigation standpoint, one of the most important things for this very specific KrbRelayUp attack is to block users from creating computer accounts. There's a lot of talk around how to do that and reasons why to do other mechanisms, but this blocks this particular attack very effectively. Additionally, configuring LDAP signing to required on domain controllers, a little bit harder to do in some cases, but should be done, and that does block and mitigate a lot of the relay attacks, not just Kerberos. And then implementing LDAP signing and channel binding. All of those are important, and we have some other mitigations in there. But Sean's going to actually walk through a lot of this and talk about some other attacks and ways that Active Directory is commonly abused by attackers, as well as the configurations, behavior, and settings within inside of Active Directory to mitigate a lot of these for very quick wins within inside of your organization. Even as simple as getting this done today, this week, or this month, these mitigations will go a long ways in making that security maturity and protecting your environment overall.
Thanks, Tyler. So we now pivot to the first category in our collection of ways to improve Active Directory security quickly, which is limiting password attacks. Probably the most prevalent attack against any AD environment involves attacking passwords. And the most popular method of attacking AD passwords is called password spraying. Password spraying works by running through a list of potential passwords and one by one attempting to authenticate as each user, starting with the first password on this list. If successful, the attacker notes this and continues. The attacker pauses after completing the password spray of each password for all users before attempting the next one. This mitigates the password or avoids the password lockout policy, since the attacker can limit the number of bad password attempts over time. Another popular method for attackers to gain knowledge of an account password is called KrbRoast or KrbRoasting. An attacker can easily identify service accounts in an AD environment through a technique I call spin scanning, which finds all service accounts in the environment with associated KrbRoast service principal names, or spins. The service accounts with spins are configured for Kerberos authentication, and the spin includes information about the server hosting the service with which the service account is associated. In normal Kerberos authentication, the user gets a Kerberos ticket called a TGT, which is their proof of identity in AD, and it's used to request a Kerberos TGS service ticket for a specific service on a server. The domain controller checks AD for that spin and identifies the associated service account that has that spin configured on it. The DC then leverages the password hash for the service account to encrypt the user service ticket, which the user will provide to the service in order to authenticate to it. The service then opens up that service ticket using its password hash, and then it can validate and authenticate the user. This process happens anywhere from a few to a dozen or more times per user on an average day in your typical environment. An attacker can request service tickets for specific service accounts, and instead of using them to authenticate to the service, they can export these service tickets, take them offline, and use their password cracking machine to attempt to crack the service account passwords by guessing different passwords to open the Kerberos service ticket. When they successfully open up a service ticket, they know the correct password for that service account. The password or the attacker has time to do this, since service account passwords almost never change. During AD security assessments, we have found highly privileged service accounts that have passwords that are 10, 15, even 20 years old. Because once an attacker discovers the correct password for the service account, they can use that to leverage the associated rights. The action slide for limiting password attack capability breaks down a mitigation for each attack I've just described. For password spraying, one of the best mitigations is to increase the password length to 12 or even up to 15 characters. Anything less than this makes it way too easy for attackers. Combining this approach with a password filter like Azure AD Password Protection restricts users from setting known bad passwords. If increasing the password length is not something that can be done soon, implement fine-grained password policies for admin and service accounts to improve protection for them. For mitigating KrbRoast, the best method is to ensure service account passwords are 25 characters or more. Make it really difficult to try to crack those passwords. Even better, shift these service accounts to GMSAs where possible, since AD manages and automatically rotates these group managed service account or GMSA passwords every 30 days by default. Trimarc posted an article on how to detect KrbRoasting, which we've linked at the bottom of the slide, and it's also in the resources section. So on to the most privileged of accounts, the AD admins. At Trimarc, we call highly privileged accounts in Active Directory AD admins. These are accounts that are members of the domain admins, administrators, and/or the enterprise admins groups. One of the first things that attackers and ransomware actually do in the environment is attempt to discover and then compromise an account with AD admin rights. Though there are a few others that are highly privileged in AD by default. The first four should be pretty obvious: domain admins, enterprise admins, administrator, schema admins. But account operators can log on to domain controllers and have built-in rights to most AD accounts and other objects. Backup operators can log on to DCs as well and can backup and restore AD. Print operators are able to log on to domain controllers and install drivers on DCs. And server operators are effectively domain controller admins. They can log on to DCs and administer most of the operations of that system. DNS admins are able to execute arbitrary DLLs on domain controllers, which enable them to elevate rights if an attacker were able to compromise one of the accounts that is in DNS admins. So it's very important to regularly review the membership of these groups, and really all these operator groups should be kept empty unless absolutely required. We typically recommend, instead of delegating out DNS admins, you just let your AD admins actually manage AD and AD integrated DNS. So your AD admins are your domain admins, administrators, enterprise admins. We regularly find AD admin accounts with old passwords, sometimes really old, as I mentioned. Old passwords often mean bad passwords, which typically result in compromised accounts. Attackers can leverage password attack techniques like password spraying and KrbRoasting in order to compromise the accounts. During our AD security assessments, we often find service accounts in groups like domain admins and enterprise admins that just don't belong. This slide provides a solid list of service accounts that don't need AD admin rights. If you have any accounts related to these names in your environment, you should delegate the appropriate permissions and rights for these accounts so they can be removed from the AD admin groups. The default domain administrator account should only be used as an emergency admin account when the other AD admin accounts are inaccessible. Should not be logged onto or used on a regular basis, so you should be able to set alerting to broadcast loudly whenever someone does use this account. This account should never have a spin, since that means it's used as a service account, and it shouldn't be used as a service account. If there is a spin on this account, an attacker could compromise that server to compromise AD, or potentially KrbRelayUp the domain administrator account, get that password to compromise AD. And if this account is disabled, that's great, but are you monitoring for it being re-enabled? That's an important step to do. The PowerShell command at the top of the slide should provide you with a good list of who your AD admins are, or you can use the invoke Trimarc AD checks PowerShell script, which is linked at the bottom of the slide. These accounts have full AD rights and require careful protection. The slide covers the most important checks to perform on these accounts, which I'm not going to go through since most of them are the same as the previous slide. This action slide covers the most important things to do relating to improving the security of AD admin accounts. The first step is always reviewing the membership of these highly privileged groups, then ensure they have recent passwords. Note any service accounts that are listed and scrutinize their need for full AD admin rights. Ensure that you protect AD admin accounts from KrbRelayUp delegation attacks by flagging them as sensitive and add to the protected users group. Check for spins on these accounts and remove any on the accounts associated with people. Disable the inactive accounts and remove from privileged groups after disabling. And for highly privileged service accounts, these are regularly exploited by attackers, so it's critical to scrutinize their rights. Since service account passwords rarely change, it's important to explore GMSAs as an option to ensure these service account passwords actually do change. Ensure that service accounts that have AD admin rights are only on tier 0 systems that are protected like domain controllers. So next on the menu is discussing some security checks for Active Directory certificate services. ADCS is Microsoft's PKI system and is often used to handle automatic computer certificates and sometimes admin smart cards. However, a number of the typical configurations are exploited by attackers to compromise AD. Securing HTTP endpoints in ADCS is a mitigation for both KrbRelayUp and Petit-Podem, as well as others. From a security perspective, the best thing you can do is to remove all ADCS HTTP endpoints. If that's not possible, the first box on the left includes the most important things to do, which includes enforcing HTTPS and enabling EPA. Disabling NTLM and ADCS helps improve ADCS security as well, and we recommend doing that if at all possible. The first thing you should check is to ensure that only AD and PKI admins have modify rights to PKI objects in Active Directory. Jake on the Trimarc team has published a number of code snippets to help discover these issues, and the link to his GitHub is shown on the relevant slides, including this one. Here's the result of the code snippet from the previous slide. When checking for these PKI objects in AD, looking at the permissions, here we can see that everyone has generic all, which is full control rights to the NT auth certificates object in AD. This is less than ideal. And in order to fix this, we need to go to the object in AD and actually remove this permission. And if you're in a single CA environment and you don't see the highlighted text showing edit F attribute subject alt name 2, then you're safe. Well, other than the fact that you're only running a single CA, because you really should be running 2 or more. In a multi-CA environment, this command can be targeted to each issuing CA via the -config and then identifying the machine CA name switch. All CAs have to be checked. If this flag is set on any single CA, it absolutely can be abused. Running this command that we show here removes this flag from this example CA. This would be you would need to run this multiple times in order to resolve this issue for each CA that has this flag set. So in Active Directory Certificate Services, a template is a set of configurations that makes creating and assigning certificates to entities more efficient and consistent. An ADCS template configured where a user can set the certificate subject enables a user to be able to request a certificate for any AD user, including AD admins. Trimarc performs AD security assessments that includes a review of the ADCS environment, and during these assessments, we have found this dangerous configuration in most of the environments. Using this code snippet, we can identify templates with dangerous configurations, and we can see the results here. There are 3 templates in this environment that we consider have dangerous configurations. We can completely resolve this issue by preventing the configuration where the enrollee can define the subject name, but this might break things. A more balanced option is to set these templates to require PKI admin approval, though that may break workflows and certainly gives the PKI admin something else they need to check on a regular basis. But definitely review your templates to determine which option is the better approach if you have this configured in your environment. So I covered a few checks you can perform in your ADCS environment using code snippets Jake has on GitHub, linked at the bottom. Reviewing and resolving these issues will greatly improve your security posture, especially since Trimarc identifies critical security issues in almost every ADCS environment that we assess. So next up is the magical world of Kerberos delegation security. Kerberos delegation solves an issue known as the double hop issue. The double hop issue occurs when you have a user connecting to a web server, which then connects to a backend database server. The web server updates records on the backend database on behalf of the user. The problem is that the Kerberos TGS service ticket the user provides to the web server is only good to authenticate to the web server. The web server can't then authenticate to the database server as the user to make the updates on the database as the user. So all of the database updates are performed in the context of the web server. Enter delegation. Kerberos delegation enables the web server to impersonate the user when connecting to the database server in order to perform the updates the user requested. Put simply, Kerberos delegation is impersonation. Starting with the release of Active Directory in the year 2000, I know that was a long time ago, the only Kerberos delegation option was unconstrained delegation, which is likely why there are so many systems configured with this today. Well, that and the fact that configuring unconstrained delegation was just click, click, done. Unconstrained delegation enables delegation of an account to any Kerberos service in AD. This means that when a user authenticates to a system with unconstrained delegation, the system can impersonate that user to any other Kerberos service on the network. If the user account that authenticates to the system service was a member of domain admins, then the system can impersonate the account with domain admin rights to the domain controller. Another issue involves vulnerability scanning accounts and domain admins. This means that when the vulnerability scanning system scans a computer with unconstrained delegation and it authenticates using Kerberos, then the system that has unconstrained delegation receives that ticket from the vulnscan account and can impersonate it. And if an attacker compromises systems with unconstrained delegation, it's often just a matter of time before a highly privileged account authenticates to it, or the attacker could influence a highly privileged account to authenticate to any Kerberos service on the system, like a file share, which would result in the same thing. That system being able to impersonate that admin. Constrained delegation limits the impersonation capability to only specific services on specific servers. At least that's how it's supposed to work. In practice, constrained delegation only really limits delegation to specific servers and the services they host. This is better than unconstrained since the system with this type of delegation can't get a delegation ticket that works just any server in AD. The user has to authenticate to the system first, and then the system requests a delegation ticket to the service and server, which the DC compares to the delegation list for that system, and if it matches, provides a delegation ticket. Constrained delegation with protocol transition is what I call Kerberos magic. The user doesn't have to authenticate first to the system, since this type of delegation is meant to support authentication that doesn't easily translate to AD authentication protocols. So using something like client certificates. The system configured this way just requests delegation tickets for the delegated services on servers and will receive them from ADC. And the last type mentioned here is resource-based constrained delegation, which Tyler already covered. The important takeaway is that it changes the delegation path, where instead of delegation being performed on the web server in the previous slide, it would be configured on the database server. This type of delegation was meant to provide the resource more control over delegating to it. So discovering accounts in AD that have Kerberos delegation is a bit complicated, since you have to perform bitwise operations on the user account control attribute and check 2 other attributes to see if they are configured, then filter out domain controllers and read-only domain controllers which have Kerberos delegation configured by default. So the good news is we made it easy for you. Just run the invoke Trimarc AD checks PowerShell script linked in this slide. So the action slide here for Kerberos delegation starts with protecting AD admin accounts from delegation attacks with the sensitive flag. Also identify what systems are configured with delegation, and if you don't have Kerberos spins on those accounts, remove delegation since they're not talking Kerberos anymore. Then the best mitigation methods include getting all your AD admin accounts in protected users group and converting unconstrained delegation to constrained. So we now venture into the zone of protocols and defaults. In this section, we focus on auditing NTLM and SMB, as well as explore some Active Directory default configurations we feel are quite dangerous. I highly recommend configuring NTLM auditing on all DCs using the GPO configuration that we show here. Auditing SMB is a bit easier since you only have to run the PowerShell commandlet set-SMB server configuration. And you can do this on all your DCs and your servers. I believe it's 2012 and up. Then work to improve NTLM authentication security. And part of the improving security in AD is moving towards only allowing NTLM v2 and eventually disabling NTLM authentication, though that's not likely feasible in most environments, unfortunately, at this point in time. So this slide explores AD defaults we consider dangerous. The first is the AD default password policy, which sets the minimum password length to 7, which, as we have already seen, makes password spraying way too easy. This next one is one of the methods Tyler mentioned that KrbRelayUp takes advantage of. Users do not need to join computers to AD, so don't let them. Change this setting. Another default is that all computers joined to AD automatically have domain admins added to the local administrators group, which is one of the main reasons why the domain admins group is used for everything. If you do decide to remove this configuration through group policy, do add a new group like workstation admins or server admins. So there's a good method to manage these different types of systems. And finally, we have the name resolution items that Daryl covered in the beginning of this presentation. Work to limit their capability or disable entirely. This will break attack tools like Responder. An interesting carryover from the early days of AD as we shifted from Windows NT is this group called Pre-Windows 2000 Compatible Access, which was meant to enable Windows NT systems to be able to see AD. This group provides read access to AD users and groups. We often find during assessments that everyone in Anonymous are members of this group. If you find these as members in this group, first confirm that authenticated users is a member, then remove both everyone and Anonymous. They aren't needed. Later, you can test removing authenticated users from this Windows 2000 group. This does enable anonymous LDAP access when you have everyone in Anonymous providing that are members of this group, providing this type of access for anyone on the network. The action slide covers what I just talked about, so I won't cover those again. Just remember that step 1 is to audit NTLM and SMB in order to work to reduce and remove NTLM v1 and SMB v1 from your environment. So next up, local administrator accounts. When a new computer is installed, there's a default administrator account configured. So let's talk about these. The default local administrator account is the RID 500 account that is a member of the local administrators group. A lot of the time, these accounts have the same password across all workstations and many times across servers too. There's a bit of a misnomer here, which adds to the confusion. Local doesn't mean that you can't use the local administrator account and password to authenticate to other computers on the network with the same local account name and password. You absolutely can, and attackers do. If the local admin account and password is the same on all workstations, then compromise of one results in compromise of all workstations. If the local admin account and password is the same on all workstations and servers, then compromise of one results in compromise of all workstations and servers. If an attacker has admin rights on a single system, they can expand access to many reusing these local credentials and authenticating across them. With these rights, the attacker can dump LSAS to get more credentials, including AD credentials. Building on the local admin password reuse issue is how AD is administered at many organizations. The first scenario I'll cover here relates to how an AD admin credential could be compromised since the AD admin logs onto the regular user workstation with AD admin credentials. This credential goes into LSAS, which an attacker with admin rights can extract and compromise AD. LSAS is the secure security process that protects authentication, but with admin or system rights, attackers can extract that and pull that information. Scenario 2 involves an AD admin using user credentials to log onto the workstation, but leverages run as to elevate using AD admin credentials to run AD admin tools. This method places these credentials in LSAS, which an attacker with admin rights can extract and then compromise AD. I will note that while there are some protections that Windows 10 and newer can implement using VBS, which makes it harder for attackers to extract credentials, there are ways to still get credentials from an AD admin using the workstation. And a lot of the time, we have not seen these additional VBS security components configured on Windows 10 systems in enterprises. In the third scenario, the AD admin doesn't authenticate to the workstation at all, so avoids the credentials going into the local computer's LSAS. This is good and the best option of the three. But where this method falls down is that the AD admin still needs to type admin credentials on the keyboard, which can be captured by a keystroke logger. A smart card doesn't fully protect against the scenario either, since the smart card pin is cached in memory by Windows, and most admins will keep the card inserted, which means that the attacker can leverage this for authentication behind the scenes on a compromised system. The action slide here covers the most important mitigation. Step 1, implement something like Microsoft Laps to ensure local admin passwords are unique and change regularly. And this middle option provides GPO controls on how to block local administrator account use over the network, which can be implemented as a short-term mitigation while working to deploy Laps or similar. The option on the right, it restricts AD admins from being able to log onto workstations and servers, so ensure they have separate systems not affected by this GPO. As we near the end of our tour of Active Directory security, we stop near where domain controllers are stored. Domain controller security, because you can't improve AD security without some focus on DCs. The printer bug is a no-fix vulnerability in how the print spooler service handles print notification requests. An attacker is able to request that a DC sends a test print notification to any computer on the network, including systems with unconstrained delegation. And this notification is authenticated using KrbRelayUp. This means that once the test print notification is delivered to the systems with unconstrained delegation, the domain controller's computer account KrbRelayUp TGT, the DC's proof of identity, is now in memory on these systems. An attacker just needs to compromise one to compromise AD. Obviously, this is bad, but it's not just leveraging the printer bug with unconstrained delegation in the environment. There are a number of security issues with the print spooler service, and researchers and attackers continue to explore capabilities to the point where it is now too dangerous to have the print spooler service enabled and running on domain controllers. So Trimarc recommends you disable it on all DCs and servers where printing services aren't needed. The only thing disabling the print spooler service on a DC will affect is automatic printer pruning for objects in AD. And guess what? Printer pruning is not enabled by default. You need to configure through a domain controller linked GPO. So if you don't see the setting in any DC GPO, you aren't using it. So just go ahead and disable the print spooler service on DCs. And if you are using the automatic printer pruning feature, which I've only seen configured twice in the past 6 years of assessments, losing this capability is better than losing positive control of Active Directory to an attacker. Here we show how to configure a DC GPO to disable the print spooler service. You can do this through System Services under Security Settings, or just use Group Policy Preferences. Set it to disabled and you're done. During Trimarc AD security assessments, we find that about 30% of the AD force don't have advanced auditing enabled. And about 60% of the 84s we assess don't have advanced auditing configured appropriately. This means that potentially malicious AD activity is likely missed. Ensure this GPO setting at the bottom is enabled in your advanced auditing GPO to ensure that advanced auditing is actually set instead of the older standard auditing. So a fun fact, the advanced auditing GPO settings are stored in CSV files in sysvol, which means that you can just search sysvol for files named audit.csv, and assuming you have rights to view all the GPOs, which is the default, you'll be able to find all the files that configure advanced auditing and the associated GPO grids. You're welcome. Now you can find all the advanced auditing in your environment. So we include a snapshot of the advanced auditing you should enable here on domain controllers. Pretty much all of these are configured to log success and failure. I'm not going to spend much time on the slide except to point out audit KrbRelayUp service ticket operations and audit special logon. You need to enable KrbRelayUp service ticket operations to detect Kerb roasting, which we mentioned, and I have a link in the slide deck on how to do so. Audit special logon provides the ability to identify when specific members of defined groups log on. This requires pushing out a registry key as well as setting this audit flag, so best to push out to all computers via group policy. This is very helpful for tracking admin logons or even logons associated with insider threat. Another critical area to check in domain controller group policy is user rights assignments. These define additional privilege rights to domain controllers and Active Directory, and there are a lot, so let's just focus on the most important ones. The first should be familiar since we've mentioned it a few times. Don't let users join computers to AD. The second one relates to the ability to log on to domain controllers. Only AD admins should be able to do this. Debug programs is what administrators have by default, but technically no one needs this. The trusted for delegation rights define who can set KrbRelayUp delegation on accounts. Again, only AD admins should have this. No one needs load and unload device drivers on a DC when you're not an admin. The manage auditing right provides the ability to clear the log, which for some reason Exchange requires. So if you've migrated to Exchange Online and removed all of your Exchange servers, you can probably clean this one up. And the last one is really interesting since this provides the ability to get owner rights to AD objects, which is dangerous if accounts other than AD admins can do this, since an owner can set permissions on the object. So during AD security assessments, we see a lot of crazy things. Here's another Trimarc don't list. Don't install anything on a DC that doesn't support the DC's mission, which is to host Active Directory. SQL, ADFS, Azure AD Connect, a management console to control agents, these should be on member servers. Firefox, Chrome, and other user or even admin applications for managing things other than AD shouldn't be on a DC. And please don't use random remote console software, since older versions are prone to have vulnerabilities which could compromise AD through that DC. We also discover a lot of agents on DCs. The most common is gotta be VMware tools. Trimarc does have a VMware security assessment that identifies older versions of VMware tools on VMs, including looking at the security posture of the VMware vSphere environment as well as ESXi hosts. But with the Trimarc Active Directory Security Assessment, we do look at VMware tools versions on DCs and recommend keeping these current since older versions have significant vulnerabilities. Then there are agents that can install or run code, which provide a potential escalation path to AD admin rights and compromise. These include EDR and other security tools and management agents, and even the Splunk Universal Forwarder, depending on the configuration. Ensure that domain controllers are running supported Windows versions and are patched. Trimarc looks for Windows versions that are no more than 2 behind the current version, so the current version is Windows Server 2022. There's 2019 and 2016. This means our current baseline we check for is Windows Server 2016 on DCs. This action slide covers the key items that I just mentioned. Review your domain controller group policy settings to ensure advanced auditing is enabled, user rights assignments are appropriately configured. DCs should only operate as domain controllers and not be used to host other applications. Definitely review and scrutinize all agents on DCs and who controls them, because they have a pathway to become an AD admin. So the last stop on this AD security journey is Tier 0. Seems about right, since this is one of the toughest things to do, but I know what you're thinking. Sean, why are you talking about Tier 0 in a webcast related to things organizations can do quickly? Isn't Tier 0 hard? Yes. Microsoft retired the tiering model, but I find the concept of tier 0 to be relevant and helpful. So looking at the entire tier model makes it difficult to focus. So let's just look at the top of this pyramid, tier 0. Tier 0 includes domain controllers, admin systems, Azure AD Connect, ADFS, virtual infrastructure like VMware, tier 0 support systems, PKI, mainframes, etc. I know that's a lot. So let's just focus on some quick wins. This action slide is all about starting to isolate admin accounts and systems into a top-level OU created so that only AD admins have control. In a later webcast, we'll talk about privileged access workstations, aka PAWS, and more advanced tier 0 concepts. The goal here is to have admin servers, where all the admin tasks are being performed, and your admin accounts are located in a top-level OU that's protected. The next step after this would actually be working towards admin workstations that are hardened and protected. But that doesn't fall under improving Active Directory security quickly. So we're going to bump that to a part 2 webcast we'll do later. So that concludes our journey through the AD security key items. I would be remiss if I didn't mention once again the free PowerShell tool that we released that can help identify security issues in your AD environment, which covers many of the key areas I just went over and a whole bunch of extra stuff. So you can call this kind of the easy button for those quick wins to check your AD environment and make sure it looks good. Now we move on to the moment we've all been waiting for, drumroll, the Trimarc Top 10. Those of you who have looked at the agenda carefully may have noticed that there's an asterisk after this agenda item. So let's clarify what that means. And no, I'm not skipping it. That's more accurate. My issue is I just can't stop at 10 items. In the past couple of weeks while refining this presentation, the Trimarc team and I have actually came up with 30 things that we feel should be done to improve AD security more quickly. So instead of just throwing up 30 on the screen and making it a very difficult screen to read, we put together a checklist of things to do now quickly that you can do this week. I mean, recognizing it's Thursday, so probably next week. But these are the top 10 things you can work through to get done more quickly. This is kind of the list 1, do these now. And then we move on to list 2, which is the next list of 10, which are to be done next. So after you work through the first 10, you can work through these more quickly, again, over the next few weeks. And then finally, for anyone who's thinking, Sean and Trimarc, I already did complete your top 10. I'm done with that. So we wanted to make sure that you had another 10 that you could work on soon. So ultimately, completing these items will absolutely improve the security posture of your AD environment. We are publishing the slides, so you'll have the entire checklist. We're going to do a companion blog post for this webcast, so everything is written up, so you can pull that down and get that information and start implementing these things in your environment. We had to cut a bunch of things we wanted to cover since they're more difficult, and we only had an hour to talk to you. So the Trimarc team decided we will do another webcast, a part 2 of sorts, to cover the most important AD security mitigation items. We will announce this next AD security webcast in the coming months as we put it together and get some good content together for you all. Also, the next Trimarc webcast is on Thursday, July 28th from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern, and is a panel discussing security challenges in the modern environment, which includes Active Directory, Azure AD, VMware, etc. We will also discuss what ransomware and attackers are doing and methods to frustrate them. We will make this an open Teams call so people can come off mute. We can have some good discussion. Very much looking forward to that next month on the 28th. So to summarize, there are a number of things you can do to improve your AD security posture, and apparently this number of quick wins is 30. Implementing these recommendations to improve Active Directory security in your environment will definitely help improve the security of your Active Directory environment. We do also perform Active Directory security assessments for organizations of all sizes, from hundreds of users to hundreds of thousands of users. So we've looked at very small ones, very big ones across different industries, from energy to finance to banking, nonprofits, university, education, media, pretty much just about every environment we've looked at, manufacturing, ICS, etc. So feel free to reach out if you want to talk to our technical assessment team about your concerns and challenges in your own environment. So that has been our time. Thank you very, very much for yours. Now we move on to the questions. So I'll ask Daryl and Tyler to come off of mute, and we'll take a look at the questions that we have already. Tyler and Daryl, I don't know if you want to start off with one of the first questions that we have that you'd like to start.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, there's a lot of great questions in here. We've been trying to kind of answer them as we go. I'm trying to think, there's a couple good ones that we had. Is it recommended to add domain admins to protected users, as it's read that it's not recommended? And does protected users cause any cross-domain issues if using a red forest or similar?
That's a good question. There's only been 2 issues that I have seen that have come up with using protected users for AD admins. One is for a scenario where there is some sort of delegation required because that AD admin account is being used for something else. In that example, the AD admin was using a tenable admin console, and it wasn't allowing them to authenticate or log in while they were in protected users. Our recommendation there is use another admin account or another account to control Tenable instead of the AD admin account. The other scenario that we've seen is in the situation where there are multiple RDP servers that are set up for AD admins. They want to abstract the name of those, kind of make those ephemeral, have them so that they could spin up new ones and get rid of old ones to keep a standard baseline. And they were using DNS round robin to enable access to those. DNS round robin would not map so that DNS host name to the actual real name, so it breaks Kerberos. Protected users forces Kerberos AES, does not allow NTLM, doesn't allow caching of passwords on a computer, and also stops Kerberos delegation. So any scenarios where those things would be required will break that. For strict AD administration, there is nothing that protected users should block. So that's why we strongly recommend AD admins. Second, softer recommendation is for all admin accounts as possible, but we do recognize there are some workflows where that might not work.
So I've got a good question for you, Sean. It says, are DNS admins considered AD admins only if DNS is installed on the DCs, or is that regardless?
Good question. So I would say if AD integrated is installed, integrated DNS is installed and DNS services are running on the domain controllers as system. So that is a bit of a caveat there. For a DEF CON talk that I did in 2020, I actually did a security posture review of a number of hosted Active Directory environments, so Azure AD, AWS Managed AD, as well as GCP. And I noted that one of those actually had DNS configured, the DNS service from what I'd heard back from the hosting provider, it was not running a system. So that is a mitigation around it. But for the most part, it is, for most customers, it's not necessary for another group to be able to manage DNS. But yeah, certainly there are a few ways to mitigate it outside of just saying no one should be in DNS admins. There are definitely some gray areas and some other mitigations and configurations that could be done to help enable workflows that are necessary in an organization.
There was another great question that we have come up quite often. What is our stance about EDR being installed on domain controllers? Is this recommended, and what are some caveats to that?
So that is a fantastic question. So security tooling on domain controllers. I believe, Tyler, our stance is that yes, security tooling needs to be on domain controllers, but there needs to be additional controls in order to ensure that those who are running those tools, you know who they are, they're vetted, and that they're using special accounts that are protected in the environment. I don't know, Tyler, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think that covers quite a bit of those. Really making sure, again, you're using those desktops that admins have separated out for themselves so that the credentials aren't being leaked all over. If their device is compromised by an attacker, they're not able to execute code directly against that domain controller through, things like a web portal to that EDR system. So again, looking at a tiered model, looking at breaking those out and keeping those accounts separate and the controls to those to a very limited number of people is probably the most important pieces, because EDR has a large swath of visibility for not only targeting specific users, but has the capability of running code on devices, as well as seeing what is being alerted and detected upon within an environment, which provides great recon and resources to an attacker.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like this question. Relay attacks against Active Directory that relay the DC's machine account back to it to gain access. Is there a way to stop the DC's machine account from being used to gain access to the DC? I don't know. I'm gonna kick that over to Tyler or Daryl to get a first crack at that.
I would say yeah, go ahead, Daryl. You can have that one for to start.
Yep. So what I was going to say about relaying and reflecting things back to yourself from an LLM&R standpoint, that is very difficult to do. To relay it back to yourself, you'll end up with an NTLM error due to the challenge mechanism that's used. However, with Kerberos and Kerberos relaying, Kerberos replaying, you definitely can do that depending on the types of delegations that are in place. And I do believe depending on the delegations that are in place, such as resource-based constrained delegation, there's not much that you can do to stop that, as opposed to restrict the permissions to enable that type of delegation to begin with.
Yeah, I would also add to that, like in particular, I imagine that they're speaking directly to something like the printer bug, where you're able to coerce that domain controller to relay that credential back to something that an attacker controls. First off, the best advice is to disable that print spooler. You have to have the ability to trigger that authentication of the domain controller computer account back to the attacker's controlled device. And that typically relies on a few things like the printer bug. If the print spooler is not available, your ability to get the domain controller to a very specific target in order to authenticate for something like a silver ticket or that domain controller computer account, that becomes much more difficult from the attacker standpoint. So you do have to, you put some controls in place, you harden the DC, you make sure you don't have things like the printer bug or print spooler vulnerability there, and put some of the mitigations with KrbRelayUp with LDAP signing being required on the domain controllers. That eliminates a good portion of the capability of an attacker to relay, especially that domain controller computer account.
Absolutely. Very good. There is a question here that I want to answer quickly. Does joining a PC to a domain with AD admin credentials leave the AD admin hash on that PC? Depending on how it's joined, the answer is yes or no. Yes or no. I'd recommend if you're using the AD admin credential to join that computer to the domain, that you restart after you do the join, which you have to do anyway, just to make sure those credentials get flushed. Credentials go into LSAS when you're actively logged onto the system. It was pointed out to Microsoft in, I believe, the 2015 timeframe or before, that there were many scenarios where after you logged off the Windows computer, Windows kept those credentials in LSAS. So a reboot was the way to ensure that those got flushed. There was a patch for that, but really until 2012 R2 timeframe, those were still not happening appropriately behind the scenes. So I like that question. Let's see, we got a few more minutes for questions, and we're happy to stay on a little bit longer if you all want to hang out with us and ask some more questions. So let's see.
The KrbTGT one is kind of interesting. It says if you compromise or suspect a compromise, would you rotate the KrbTGT before resetting the service and domain user passwords, or does the order not matter?
That is a great question. So if you believe that there is some sort of compromise, and I'll just use the example of you've had a pen test or a red team engagement, and they have said, hey, we were able to compromise the environment. We went ahead and put, we put our account name into domain admins or whatever that scope was. At that point, I would strongly recommend rotating the KrbTGT once today, and then probably wait 7 days and then change it again, assuming that obviously you trust this organization that you hired to do this engagement. That will ensure that that password changes twice. Changing it with about a 7 to 8 day time but in between will reduce the potential of causing issues in the environment. We worked with lots of large companies with financial and other type mission critical systems, and we have not heard of any issues with changing the KrbTGT in the manner that I just said, especially if they are doing it proactively and have it done. We usually recommend twice a year, so every 6 months, basically have a rotating scenario on the schedule. We know of some customers that do it quarterly. In this situation, where it's important to get it done, I would say, yes, change it once, wait 7 days, change it again. I would also ensure that any of the admin accounts in the environment does change, especially if that engagement with that company was scoped around dumping passwords, password hashes, things like that. And Tyler, I'm interested in your addition to my answer on this.
No, I completely agree. I think that's very important. Honestly, when you're doing it, your time to remediation, the dwell time of the attacker becomes very critical. So the order in which you do it probably is more around your policy and instant response capabilities. If you've got a good IR team and you're doing the mitigations in place, a lot of these should be happening in conjunction with each other. So rotating the user's passwords, obviously is probably first priority. It's going to kill them. They may have active sessions. The KrbTGT is obviously going to negate some of those tickets once that's done twice. So you may run into some problems where users have to re-sign into something or sign in again. That seems like a viable problem to have versus the compromise and the potential for an attacker to continue using a credential.
Yeah, great points. There is a question here. Do you have any recommended resources that have collections of current recommended best practices for securing AD? AD security has a pretty good collection of links, but it doesn't look like it's been updated frequently. I absolutely agree. The person who runs that apparently has been slacking and has not done really any updates there at all. I think that it would be fantastic if, as part of our blog post article that we'll put on the Trimarc Content Hub, in the coming month, which captures the information from this webcast, we'll provide a bunch of resources as well. And we've captured a bunch at the end of this webcast where we put together a number of references around recommendations and things like that. So yeah, we will definitely pull that together and help with that. I mean, it's challenging because some of the things about Active Directory haven't changed since the beginning of AD, and a whole lot of other things have changed from the security perspective. So it can be a little difficult to keep up. So we'll see what we can do to help around that. And it's 4:15 now. I think we'll probably do 2 more questions. I see we still have a bunch of people hanging on. So Tyler, Darrell, what do you have?
Why has MSFT retired the tier model, and is there something better?
Yes, I really like this question. So knowing that I'm being recorded, I will say that I like the tier model from the logic side of it. Unfortunately, it was incredibly difficult to actually do in practice. I think I'm aware of 1, maybe 2 organizations that have done the entire thing. I know a lot of organizations that have done quite a bit of the tier model, tier 0, tier 1. A lot of organizations went with the Microsoft recommended ESAE or Red Forest or Admin Forest, all the same thing. Microsoft recognized that it was very expensive to deploy that. Of course, if you were deploying it Microsoft's way, you had to have Microsoft Consulting actually do that, pay them a lot of money, pay a lot of money on new hardware. And then your operations folks have a ton of extra stuff that they have to do in order to leverage that the operational component involved with an admin forest, having additional smart cards, logging on to the PAW that connects to that environment, going through a bunch of extra steps just to do 1 or 2 things. And I think I know 30 to 40 companies, or actually maybe 50 companies, that have admin forests. So they're out there. Microsoft shifted from this because a lot of the things that were recommended, at least I think, were sort of more the academic type thing. It was very difficult to do in the real world. So they've shifted over to this ramp approach, which is more cloud-based. Now, there are folks out there that have argued that Microsoft is pushing everyone to the cloud because it makes them more money. I think that is probably part of it. The cloud also can change more quickly. What we're seeing people move to is actually having a second tenant that is leveraged as sort of that admin environment versus a separate AD forest. Now, certainly there's some additional complexities around going through something like that, but I think that that's really where things are headed at this point. There are some huge benefits to leveraging a cloud service, but of course there is the whole issue around trust. Do you trust that cloud service? Do you have controls around that? Cloud is newer, so it is more challenging. It's a big paradigm shift. We are going to do a webcast, hopefully this fall, to do something very similar to this, the top 10 ways to improve Azure AD and Office 365 or Microsoft Office 365 security more quickly as well. So we'll cover a lot of the key things that we find as part of our Trimarc Microsoft Cloud Security Assessments, which focus on Azure AD. So I think we'll probably do 1 more, and then we'll close this out. Really appreciate everyone coming on and joining us today. We had a huge turnout for this webcast, so it always makes us feel good. And also, we're glad that we can provide this great information to the community, and it certainly makes us want to do it again. So I don't know, Tyler, Daryl, do you have another question that we can close out with?
Yeah, I've got a good one, just because I think it should be addressed. So it says, what is your stance on NPS on domain controllers in small environments? How bad is quote unquote secured? What about ADCS on a domain controller?
Yeah.
You can actually roll one other question into that as well. Azure AD Connect.
Yep.
Since it's supposed to be protected like a domain controller, is that an argument for not or running it on a domain controller?
Wow, these are really good questions. So understanding and recognizing the challenges with smaller environments, they may have 2 or 3 or 4 domain controllers and a handful of servers. My recommendation is always going to be splitting those out if you can. Certainly because there are certain things that come with those, like Azure AD Connect. If you're using the standard install, it's SQL Express. There are concerns around SQL, even SQL Express being installed on a system, because there are vulnerabilities around that if they're not patched and kept up to date. We have found SQL on servers. All those things on the domain controller don't list, we've found those on, in real environments. So I don't know, Tyler, Daryl, if you want to add to that, go for it.
No, I 100% agree with that, Sean.
Yeah, I also agree with that. It always lends itself to the ability to maintain and control that domain controller long term. If there's a vulnerability or an exploit that comes out for one of those pieces of software or something like SQL Express, that puts your domain controller and your entire environment at risk. Whereas if you're just relying on Active Directory and the core services for the domain controller, that allows you to patch and harden and manage those domain controllers much better without the worry and risk of additional exploits that you have to watch for other pieces of software for vulnerability management and attack surface reduction.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, the thing is, the more, like Tyler said, the more you add to your DC, the more you increase that attack surface area. So it just makes it potentially more dangerous for having those things on DCs. So I see a question here that I want to answer. Did server/print operators have a different purpose historically? Was server operator intended as a general server admin back in the Windows NT days? All right, so you're pushing my knowledge back to when I actually managed Windows NT. And yes, these were effectively a carryover from those days. I actually took in a slide that I did, I think it was a NOLACon a number of years ago, where I had server operators, backup operators, print operators, etc. And I just crossed out what they were and just put DC, local print operator, server operator, whatever, because those in Active Directory, we have found environments where server operators, okay, well, those are admins for the servers, so we'll add a whole bunch of people into there. It doesn't make a lot of sense now. NT, it was very much, these are the rights you had for these groups, you would use those groups, then you'd have those rights in the environment. In Active Directory, for better or worse, you're able to customize and delegate just about anything you want at a very granular level. So we don't need to use those groups. Microsoft actually says don't use account operators ever. So that's great advice. If the vendor says don't use this, definitely don't use that. We recommend not using the others as well. Backup operators, a little bit of a difference there. Go ahead and use backup operators for your backup system. We would much prefer to see backup service accounts in backup operators instead of domain admins, which we've found as well. But again, depending on what you're backing up and you're restoring, if you're doing per attribute restorations, you probably have to put that service count for something like Commvault into the administrators group in the domain, for example. So, all right, well, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. We will be getting the slides and the video posted. We will also email out everyone who registered that information. We really appreciate that you trust us with your email accounts. I know there's a bunch of private emails that are being used. That's fine. We will not send you anything if you did not ask for it. If you said no, thank you to both of the questions, we will not be reaching out beyond this. So because of that, well, actually, there's one more email you'll get after the webcast. Just letting you know, thank you very much for joining, as well as the information about the webcast, but that's it. We don't add you to marketing lists. We don't believe in that. So we just want to use the the registrations for the webcast. And if you're interested in getting our newsletter, great. We're going to send that to you. If you're not interested, that's okay too. But we're happy to do this. We're glad that we can do this for the community. Thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us. We appreciate it. And thank you very much. We'll end there. Have a great day.